April 20th, 1945. Deep beneath the shattered streets of a dying Berlin, the Führer was celebrating a birthday he in no way deserved. He sat in his concrete tomb, surrounded by maps of phantom armies and the echoes of his own hollow pronouncements, clinging to the illusion of divisions that had already been erased from the earth. But hundreds of miles away, in the fractured landscapes of Silesia, a very different scene was unfolding. This was not a parade of polished boots and iron crosses, but a ragged, stumbling procession of women emerging from a camp gate. Their steps were so hesitant, so uncertain, they seemed afraid of the very air that lay beyond the fence. A thin, stubborn layer of snow clung to the mud-soaked ground, a final remnant of a brutal winter, and the women, many of them little more than ghosts draped in rags, looked as though they might dissolve into it. An American general, his uniform impeccably pressed, despite the mud caking his boots, raised a hand, not in command, but in a gesture that seemed almost like a blessing. "You have your freedom," he announced, his voice carrying a weight of both solemnity and profound relief. For a moment, that declaration hung over the camp like smoke. It was a word that should have ignited cheers, or tears of gratitude, or a desperate, joyful exodus. But instead, a thick, heavy silence descended. The women simply looked at one another, their eyes hollowed out by years of hunger and a deep, abiding distrust. The word freedom, as it reached their ears, was not a promise. It was a terrifying question. Many of them had been taken years before, wrenched from their homes in towns across East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia. They were German civilians, rounded up and pressed into forced labor to feed the Reich's insatiable war machine. Some were there as punishment for an act of defiance, a word spoken out of turn. Others were simply unlucky, caught in the path of a military sweep. They had been catalogued and confined, their bodies reduced to units of labor, their names forgotten and replaced with numbers. They had survived winters without a scrap of firewood, subsisting on meals that were nothing more than boiled weeds and potato peeling, if preparing to run, but her feet remained frozen to the ground. She remembered the stories whispered in the darkness of the barracks, stories of trains heading east, not toward home, but into a new kind of darkness, a void from which no letter ever returned. The general's words echoed again, but they seemed to be fading, losing their meaning as they traveled across the muddy ground. Freedom, yes, but freedom to go where? Behind them lay years of captivity, humiliation, and a hunger so deep it had become a part of them. Before them stretched a Germany in utter ruin, a landscape of bombed-out cities where food was rationed in handfuls of flour, where children dug through rubble for splinters of firewood, and where the armies of the victors brought both liberation and the threat of retribution. For women whose families were scattered, lost, or annihilated, the word home was not a destination. It was a wound. Official histories, compiled later in the sterile quiet of Allied offices, would estimate that in the year 1945 alone, nearly 12 million ethnic Germans were displaced from the East. Entire villages were emptied overnight. Overloaded trains groaned with refugees. Endless columns of people trudged west, their feet sinking into the same mud and snow these women now stood upon. They were no longer captives, but they had just become part of a larger, more terrifying tide of dispossession. To send them back east would be to deliver them directly into Soviet hands, where vengeance for German atrocities often came swiftly and without mercy. The Allied officers knew this, even if official policy demanded repatriation whenever possible. But the women knew it more keenly, in the marrow of their bones. They knew it through the terror etched into their memories, the screams, the flames, the endless fields of the dead they had heard about. For a modern viewer, It may seem incomprehensible to imagine anyone refusing freedom. Yet the silence at that camp gate was not born of ingratitude. It was born of a terrifying clarity. Freedom had no meaning without safety. It had no sweetness without the simple certainty of survival. To step back toward the east was to gamble with life itself. And so, while the vanished while they were gone, in that silence, the seeds of a dilemma were sown, a dilemma that would preoccupy Allied officials for years to come. The war was ending, the camps were being opened, but what was to be done with those who could not or would not return? In the spring of 1945, the word home was both the sweetest and most bitter sound on the lips of millions of Europeans. For the American general who had declared freedom at the camp gates, home was an obvious, logical destination. What else could the liberated possibly want but to return to the life that was stolen from them? Yet, for the women who stood listening, gaunt and shivering in the sharp April wind, home had become a ghost. The Germany they remembered no longer existed. It was a land fractured, scorched, and occupied, a place where the very idea of safety had been erased along with the walls of their childhood houses. The Allied advance had peeled back the curtain of propaganda to reveal a landscape of utter ruin. Cities like Dresden, Cologne, and Hamburg were not merely damaged, they were flattened into seas of brick dust and twisted steel. Berlin itself was a carcass of stone, where fires still smoldered in the skeletons of buildings, and ghost-like children lived in the shadows, scratching through rubble for a lump of coal or a hardened bread crust. Food rationing, when it was available, offered civilians barely 1,000 calories a day, and often far less. Mothers learned to mix sawdust into bread dough, a trick to make the loaves seem larger, to fill bellies with something other than air. The women returning from the camps knew this. They knew that if they managed to reach these cities, they would only trade one kind of hunger for another, deeper hunger. They would trade the confines of a labor camp for food queues that wound around entire blocks, trading their forced patience for a gnawing desperation. But even starvation was not their greatest fear. For those who had come from the east, from East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, the word home now signified a geography that had already been erased from the map. By the war's end, nearly 12 million ethnic Germans would be expelled or forced to flee from Eastern Europe. Vanished somewhere on the endless Eastern Front. Her parents had been killed when their town was shelled into oblivion, and the house she grew up in had been claimed by Polish settlers under new decrees backed by the Soviets. "My home," she later told a relief worker, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, "is in the ground." Such statements were common. They were terse and final, as if the women feared that to admit their grief in fuller words would shatter the fragile strength they had left. For many, the choice to stay was not born of hope, but of a cold, rational dread. Allied records note instances where trains bound for the east had to be guarded, not to keep civilians from escaping, but to stop them from tearing their way out. Some women leaped from moving train cars, preferring to risk the unknown wilderness rather than return to lands where the Red Army now reigned. A U.S. Army chaplain stationed in Bavaria recorded the words of one displaced woman who begged him, her hands clasped as if in prayer, "Better to starve here in the shadow of your flag than to be safe there under theirs." Her plea was not romantic. It was chillingly practical. Starvation, disease, uncertainty, these were horrors they had learned to survive. Revenge was not. Yet the paradox was cruel. To refuse repatriation meant to remain stateless. These women were technically free, but they had no country to claim them. They were classified instead as displaced persons, and they lined up daily for meager rations in camps that looked horrifyingly similar to the prisons they had just escaped. But even there, amid the mud, the crowded bunks, and the endless paperwork of survival, there was at least one fragile, precious gift: the knowledge that tomorrow would not be dictated by the arrival of Soviet officers or the whistle of the next bombardment. It was a life stretched thin, but it was theirs to live. Amid these stories of grim survival, humor occasionally surfaced, sharp and brittle as broken glass. A British officer once recounted how, when he asked one German woman why she wouldn't go back to her village, she muttered under her breath, "Because I am fond of eating." The remark earned alone. Each one was a logistical problem. Each one was a moral burden. How do you send people home when they insist that home has become a graveyard? In one camp in Bavaria, American guards reported that women tore up their repatriation papers, refusing to sign their names to any document that could deliver them back to the East. They acted, one officer wrote in his report, as though to sign their name was to sign their own death warrant. Through these small, desperate acts of refusal, a new identity began to emerge. They were not German nationals returning to their country's ruins. They were displaced women, forging an existence out of nothing. It is easy, decades later, to frame these decisions as mere practicality. But at the time, each refusal carried the weight of defiance, a silent, powerful stand against the tide of history that sought to sweep them back into suffering. When offered a freedom defined by a return to devastation, they chose instead the profound uncertainty of exile. It was not hope that fueled their decision, but the raw, unblinking clarity that survival sometimes means never, ever going home. By 1947, the war in Europe had been over for 2 years. Yet for thousands of German women, the chapter labeled "after" had not yet truly begun. They remained where they had been, in the sprawling displaced persons camps scattered across the continent, suspended in a disorienting limbo that was neither captivity nor freedom. Their defiant refusal to return to the East had spared them the terror of vengeance, but it had not delivered them into a place of belonging. They existed instead in the gray zone of the unwanted, their futures debated in hushed tones in faraway government offices, while their lives unfolded, day by monotonous day, inside the familiar perimeter of barbed wire. The women had learned to build routines from the fragments of exile. Each morning, thin smoke curled from the chimneys of camp kitchens, where watery porridge simmered in vast iron pots. Laundry lines, heavy with patched garments washed until the fabric was thin as gauze, stretched between barracks. In the dusty courtyards, children played with toys fashioned from wood scraps and old tin cans, their sudden bursts of laughter sounding startlingly loud, less by who they were than by what they represented and what they had lost. To carry a German identity in 1947 was to carry a burden heavier than any suitcase. It meant enduring suspicion, stigma, and a pervasive, crushing silence. For some, escape came in the form of marriage. Allied soldiers stationed near the camps courted women, drawn by a spark of beauty, a moment of shared companionship, or perhaps the simple, powerful allure of rescuing someone from purgatory. These unions offered a pathway out, a chance at official papers, a passage on a ship, a new life in a country where the past was not a constant, accusing presence. Yet they were not simple solutions. Within the camps, whispers followed these war brides, quiet accusations of betrayal or desperation. Survival, it turned out, often required choices that dignity could not always bless. Still, for those who boarded ships bound for America, Canada, or Australia, the gamble represented a chance to redefine the word home on their own terms. Others clung to the hope of return, not to the lost lands of the East, but to the western zones of Germany, where the ruins were at least familiar. By 1950, West Germany was beginning the monumental task of absorbing millions of displaced people, and the women who once refused to go back now faced a different, more subtle challenge: how to integrate into a society that often viewed them as strangers, unwelcome reminders of a past everyone desperately wanted to bury. History records that not all of them stayed silent. In the dusty archives of the International Refugee Organization, their testimonies can still be found. Their voices, captured on paper, are steady, matter-of-fact, even blunt. One woman wrote, "I would rather die without a flag than live under one that destroys me." Another declared, "Freedom is not to go back. Freedom is to remain alive." These statements reveal the stark clarity of their decisions, choices shaped not by politics or ideology, but by the elemental, primal instinct to survive. As the 1940s drew to a close, the great tide of displaced persons began to recede, sentence-heavy with paradox. Freedom was not a road back home, but a road that led to nowhere that was mapped. They walked it anyway, not because it promised safety or belonging, but because it allowed them to live. History often celebrates the grand decisions of leaders, the signing of treaties, the sweeping movements of armies. But here, in the hushed defiance of women who simply said no, lies another kind of courage. It is quieter, less visible, but no less transformative. Their story is not one of banners or battlefields, but of endurance in the shadows, of survival in the cracks of history. What they left unspoken still hangs in the silence, a question that cannot be answered by generals or governments, but only by the human heart. When home is gone, what does freedom truly mean? For Martya, whose home was in the ground, the years after 1947 bled into one another in a haze of gray monotony. She remained in the Bavarian displaced persons camp, a sprawling city of sorrow that the world was trying to forget. Her days were marked by the clang of the morning bell, the endless queue for watery soup and hard bread, and the work she was assigned in the camp's massive laundry. She spent hours over steaming tubs, her hands raw and red, scrubbing the uniforms of the American soldiers who were her guards, her providers, and her unwitting captors. The laundry was a world of its own, filled with the hushed German of other women who, like her, had refused the journey east. They were a silent sisterhood, bound by a shared, unspoken trauma. They did not speak of the homes they had lost, or the families that had vanished. Instead, they spoke of the immediate, a rumor of extra rations, the quality of the lye soap, the cough that was rattling through Barrack C. To speak of the past was to risk drowning in it. It was in this world of steam and silence that she met Sergeant Davis. He was not a guard at the towers, but a clerk in the administration office, a man whose war had been fought with paper and ink. He was quiet, with kind eyes that seemed to see past the Enemy National label stamped on her identity card. He would sometimes bring his own show. Felt nothing like a bride. She felt a cold, sharp clarity, the same clarity she'd felt at the camp gate years before. This was not a choice of the heart. It was a choice of survival. A signature on a piece of paper in exchange for a boat ticket to a continent that had not been turned to rubble. She said yes. The wedding was a sterile affair in a drab office, witnessed by another officer and a translator. She wore a dress pieced together from a discarded parachute. He wore his uniform. They exchanged vows they barely understood, a contract that promised her a future in exchange for the erasure of her past. The voyage across the Atlantic was a disorienting fever dream. She was seasick for 2 weeks, crammed into a crowded cabin with other war brides, a cacophony of German, Italian, and French accents, all mingling with the groan of the ship's engines. In the moments she could stand on deck, she watched the endless gray water, and felt a terror that dwarfed anything she'd known before. She was leaving the only world she knew, a world of ruins, to go to one she could not imagine. As the ship passed the Statue of Liberty, the other women rushed to the rail, weeping with joy and hope. Martya stayed back, her hands gripping the cold metal. The statue looked impossibly large, austere, and distant. It did not feel like a welcome. It felt like a warning. Ohio was a shock. The sheer, unapologetic abundance of it all was overwhelming. Houses with green lawns, stores overflowing with food, cars gleaming in the sun. After years of starvation, the sight of a grocery store made her physically ill. Davis's family was kind in a loud, boisterous way she found exhausting. They patted her on the back, filled her plate with food she couldn't eat, and spoke to her in slow, loud English as if she were a child. The marriage was a quiet, lonely affair. Sergeant Davis, now just Frank, was a good man. He was patient. He did not press her to speak of the past he could never comprehend. But his kindness was a wall she could not scale. At night, she lay beside him in the dark, her body rigid, haunted by nightmares of fire. Even in a land of plenty? How could she describe the smell of a burning city to a child who had only ever smelled cut grass? The moment she had always dreaded came on a quiet afternoon. Susan, then 7 years old, came home from school with a family tree project. "Mommy," she asked, her crayon poised over the paper, "what were your mommy and daddy's names? Where did they live?" The simple question struck Martya with the force of a physical blow. She looked at her daughter's innocent, expectant face, and the wall of silence she had so carefully constructed for over a decade began to crumble. She could give her the names, but what could she say about the place? A city that no longer existed, a home that was in the ground. That night, after Susan was asleep, Martya sat down at the small kitchen table. The house was quiet, filled with the gentle hum of the refrigerator, a sound of peace she had never gotten used to. For the first time in 15 years, she did not push the memories away. She let them come. The face of her mother, the smell of her father's pipe, the cobblestones of Königsberg, the terror in the camp, the cold calculation of her survival. She took out a pen and a piece of paper. Her hand trembled. She began to write, not a letter to anyone, but a story for someone, for her daughter. She wrote in German, the language of her heart, the words flowing out of her like a dam breaking. "Mein liebes Kind," she began, "my dear child." She wrote through the night, the story of a girl from a city of amber who became a woman in a world of ash. She wrote of hunger and of fear, but also of the stubborn, quiet refusal to disappear. It was not a plea for pity or a confession of guilt. It was a testimony. As the first light of dawn crept into the kitchen, staining the linoleum floor a pale gray, Martya finally put down her pen. She was exhausted, but a profound sense of calm had settled over her. The general at the gate had offered her one kind of freedom. Her husband had offered her another. But this, she realized, was the only freedom that truly mattered. Not the freedom to go somewhere,